Hello, and welcome to this interactive case workshop organised by COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics. It's part of the online COPE Seminar 2021 themed Together Shaping the Future of Publication Ethics. This workshop is mainly for new or recent COPE members and aims to introduce you to COPE, some COPE Council members, and some publication ethics issues. We'll highlight some COPE resources, and there'll be some interactive audience polls based on 4 past COPE forum cases, so I hope you find this session useful and interesting. I'm Trevor Lane. I'll be your moderator for this workshop. I'm a publishing consultant joining you from Hong Kong, and I've been a COPE member and COPE Council member for over 5 years. In the past 25 years, I've worked in editing, publishing, and training in Asia and the US, and for full disclosure, I occasionally provide author training for Asia Edit and Nature Research Academies. This workshop will begin with an introduction to COPE given by Michael Wise from Perth, Australia, followed by interactive case presentations from Anna Marusic from Croatia and Simon Lineker from the UK. The last 15 minutes or so will be devoted to a general Q&A session, so again, please type your questions in the Q&A box. If you wish to ask a question to Michael, Anna or Simon, please include that at the beginning of the question. All attendees can see each other's questions and can upvote ones they want answered. So your presenters today are Michael Wise, COPE trustee and treasurer. He's a bioinformaticist and computer scientist in the Department of Computer Science and Software Engineering at the University of Western Australia, and he co-founded the journal Microbial Informatics and Experimentation. Anna Marusic is COPE Council member and Professor of Anatomy and Chair of the Department of Research in Biomedicine and Health at the University of Split School of Medicine, Croatia, and she's the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Global Health. And we have Simon Lineker, COPE trustee, who's Director of International Marketing and Development at Cabell's, having spent 15 years at Emerald Publishing, and he's a tutor at the Association of Learned and Professional Society Publishers. So now I'd like to pass the screen and microphone to Michael.
So I'm Michael Wise. I'm the treasurer of COPE, and my day job is as an academic at the University of Western Australia, where I teach computer science and research in bioinformatics and computational biology. So what I want to do this afternoon, this evening, wherever you are, is say a little bit about COPE, who we are, which is to say you, and talk about the core practices. But really, I'm only going to talk about 2 of them because there's not enough time. But the punchline here is really that we have lots and lots of different resources, and I'm just going to use 2 of these just to illustrate the wealth of stuff that's available to you. So COPE. First of all, this picture is out of date. So the dots represent where COPE councillors are, and we already have 2 extra dots in China, a dot in Israel, and a dot in India. I think there's now the other dots have disappeared. But as this is what all this is saying is that this is an international organization, and I happen to be the easternmost dot at the moment. We have 12,500 members, very approximately, in 103 countries. And one of the things that I hope you will enjoy with COPE, if you assuming you're new here, is that it is a genuine collegial body. I mean, those of us who work at universities, they're becoming more and more managerialist, and COPE is really still very, very collegial. And so your voice can be heard, and when you go to a forum, you can pipe up and say what it is that you believe to be true about the given case. That's just really rather wonderful. And of course, you can run for office and so on. These are a lot of the COPE documents are structured around these 10 core practices, which are based on a set of 16 principles. They're called principles of transparency. And so just going very quickly over them, it is assumed that all journals will have some way of dealing with allegations of misconduct. All journals will have policies related to who is an author and who are contributors. That all journals should have a way of registering complaints and appeals to all journals are expected to have policies around conflicts of interest All journals are expected to have some policies regarding data, and of course that doesn't necessarily apply to certain journals in the arts maybe, or in mathematics, but where data is a relevant consideration, there should be policies regarding how that is to be done. All journals are expected to have proper norms of ethical oversight. So talking about the usual things like fabrication and falsification. In the health sciences, we've got talking about informed consent, ethical overview, generally, experimental use of experimental treatment of experimental animals, what have you, and that goes under this particular banner. Next one is that all journals are expected to have some way of saying how they handle intellectual property, for example, and copyright transfer, the rest of it. All journals. Next one is all journals are meant to have proper management systems. Oops. Sorry about that. And some way of, for example, inducting editors and training, staff training. Next one is that all journals are expected to have a proper peer review processes, and also to tell the readers what those processes actually are. And finally, all journals are expected to have some way of have post-publication discussions. So letters to the editor, or ways of having corrections, and so on. So now I just want to move to just two examples from that. So the first one is allegations of misconduct. So these are the sort of resources that you have at your disposal. The first one I've said here is seminars, but that also includes a very valuable resource, which is actually forum. So if you haven't been to a forum before, I really recommend it. All forums are very similar in structure, where the first part is a discussion. The discussion is often then becomes a discussion document, which then eventually evolves into policies. This is part of our policy formulation process. The second half of the forum is going to be is typically a range of cases, such as you'll be doing this afternoon, this morning, this evening, wherever you are. So that's the biggest range. That's the biggest resources as you can very easily take advantage of, and I would heartily recommend it. Other resources are the flowcharts, which are very popular. So, for example, in terms of for misconduct, what does a reviewer do when they suspect it is to have appropriated another author's ideas or data? We also have guidelines. So these are sort of less prescriptive than flowcharts, but they give you general guidelines of how to do things. For example, sharing of information among editors in chief. So the problem here is when you have a particular incident that possibly goes across multiple journals, here there's a protocol for editors to talk to each other. Then we have case discussions, and you always should look for those. For example, sharing by a reviewer on social media. There was a fairly recent case about that. And of course, we have all sorts of webinars, and so, for example, in the 2019 allegations of misconduct. So there's a number of guidelines which we have a very wonderful publication person to make look pretty. And this is what one of the guidelines looks like. This is the guideline for sharing of information, and so each guideline would come with a set of guidance as well. Second example is authorship and contributorship. I hope that the difference between these is reasonably obvious. Again, the resources here is of course forum and the seminars. So then the flowcharts, well, how to recognize potential authorship problems. I would suggest maybe 50% of the queries we have are related to authorship. Publication is a human business, and yes, humans sometimes come to blows about things, and it seems to be happening with alarming regularity. So possibly the biggest source of issues for you to deal with are going to be authorship, I would imagine. So we have quite a few resources, how to recognize potential authorship problems, guidelines, how to handle them as a guide for new researchers. There's case discussions, lots and lots of case discussions. For example, here, inconclusive institutional investigation. So there's been something reported by a journal, but the universities or the institution, the journal does not believe that the institution has done a reasonably fair job of investigating it. And finally, where there's a seminar, in this case, the WCRI 2019, responsible authorship. And once again, just to emphasize the role of forum in that. So here is, for example, in this case, the flow chart for authorship. And so in this case, the changes to authorship. So where a paper has been submitted with a panel of authors, and suddenly close to acceptance or at acceptance, they suddenly want to add another one. And so again, there's authorship problems and changes of authorship. Both of these have got flow charts to help you deal with particular cases that you might see. Again, very highly, these are very commonly used resources, and again, highly recommended. Final comment here is that obviously we are an English-speaking organization. This is just partly historical and just because it was started in the UK. And so then it's spread across the English-speaking world. But of course, a lot of you are possibly not native English speakers. And so we are working towards translating more of the resources into other languages. Currently, we have at least some resources, not enough, but at least a start, in Arabic, Chinese, French, Italian, Japanese, Persian, Polish, Spanish, and Turkish. Obviously, we can't be the United Nations, but we're certainly trying to broaden our offering to you, our members. Okay, I hope I haven't exceeded my time, but so I'm going to hand you back now to Trevor.
Okay. No, you're on time, Michael. Thank you very much. And the next section now is the interactive cases, and I'd like to invite you, the audience, to take part in some interactive cases based on real cases received by COPE Forum. So here we're asking you to imagine you're the editor-in-chief of whatever journal has the problem that is being presented. So please use the chat box to comment on the cases and polls, but type any general questions on membership or ethics in the Q&A box, and we'll answer those at the end. So the first case now will be led by Anna.
Okay, thanks. We have, as you know, 4 cases, and we first have some brief cases and then some longer ones. So this is the case 1, where you're an editor in a journal. And just let me say that these are all real cases that are available in the archive of COPE cases, and in the presentation that you will see, you can have a look at it, what actually happened and how Forum addressed it. So let's go into the heart of the matter. So as an editor, you discover that a submitted manuscript on healthcare doesn't seem to have a formal ethics approval, so it is not mentioned in the publication. And when you ask the authors to explain, they say that what they used in the paper is anonymized aggregated data on maternal mortality and quality of care in facilities in different regions of the country, that they received permission from local authorities, including local elders, community leaders, healthcare providers, to scrutinize records of facilities. And they said that this counts as an audit, so they didn't seek permissions from the University Ethics Committee. So that's the case. And our questions for you to open the discussions are the following. So what do you do? And you have these options. And now I'm going to share the polls and give you a bit of time to answer. So I'm launching the poll now. Okay, now half of you have answered. Okay, I think we have 71% of the answers, and I think we can end the poll. So most of you thought, it's about half of you thought that you as an editor have to inform the institution. Then about a third of you thought that you should reject the article. 15% would review the article as it is, and some people said other. And what we have in the chat box is that one of you, Shandeep, answered that because they should have authors get a letter from the ethics committee, probably as a waiver for the ethics approval. And Itamar also said that I would ask them to receive a letter from the local research ethics committee confirming their actions was indeed correct according to local national laws. I would say that the correct answer, so to say, would be C. And this is what the forum thought, but there are different things that we have to keep in mind. We have to mention policies that depend on the country and the legal framework in the country. And I would also say that is also difference in the field. This is medical field, so we are clear about it. And my experience with ethics approvals in medicine compared to other fields like social sciences, humanities, there the approvals are more lax and they are very often way, whereas in medicine it would be different. And any study that involves humans would have to go to an ethics approval. But on the other hand, and I'm saying this from a position of European point, this would be analysis of data. So this would be the question of personal data used in research, which would come under the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, which says that if you are using anonymized data that are fully anonymized, not the ones that have codes, because then they are pseudo-anonymized and they're still considered personal data, and you have to apply all the protection for full data or pseudo-anonymized data. If the data set is fully anonymous, then the data protection regulation doesn't apply to it and it can be used without problem. But then still, in some institutions, in some countries, you may need to have a waiver of the ethics committee for the use of such anonymized data. You may, as these authors in this paper also said, that they got an approval for audit of data, that this should be considered as an audit. So I think it's very important for a journal to have that information and to maybe even have a kind of a general approach to this. And also one of you said that, Tom, said that he went with B, but thinking more about correspondence with the institution to clarify this institution rather than informing as such. So this means that writing to the institution was more about getting the information about the local regulation and not about reporting some kind of misconduct. That's what it is. And also I have to say, and I will stop sharing now because we have been looking at these results there. When Forum looked at this case, the COPE Forum, they said that they believe that approval was not needed for this anonymized audit, and the paper was eventually accepted for publication. So this is it. But let's see what COPE tools and COPE guidance says on this. So we have one of the flowcharts. When you have a problem or ethical concern that is raised by the reviewer or the editor, and what do you do? And you see here that examples of these concerns about manuscripts can be, here you see it, lack of ethical approval, consent about concern about patient consent or protection, or animal experimentation. And then you have to thank the reviewer or the author or the editor, if it is the case, if it's one of the handling manuscript editors. Then you have to first ask the author. That would be a procedure, and you can request evidence that the ethical committee or IAB approval is in place, or the waivers are there, or some other regulations. So when you have a satisfactory response, you apologize to the author, inform the reviewer or the other presenter, and proceed with the review. If the response from the author was unsatisfactory, then you inform the authors that a review is suspended until the case is resolved. And for COPE member journals can submit this case for a COPE forum to look for guidance. And then you forward the concerns to author's employer or a person responsible for research governance institution. If there is a satisfactory response, then it's the paper is processed further, and then we have this when there is no or unsatisfactory response, so the editor keeps on trying at monthly intervals, seeking conclusion on investigation, or if there is no or unsatisfactory response, then the case may be referred to other authorities depending on the country or the field and so on. And then the reviewer or the other responder is asked about, is informed about the outcomes and the actions. And finally, you also have a guidance for editors from COPE about research, audit and service evaluation. So what can be considered an audit or service evaluation when it is research that it requires approval from ethics bodies. So this is also here something that can help you. I see there is a question and answer, but not in chat. We're going to look and monitor Q&As and discuss it at the end. So this much from me. I will stop sharing and I look forward to the full discussion at the end.
Okay, thank you, Anna, and thank you, audience, for your input. So I think the flowchart showed that you ask the author for explanation to begin with and then decide what to do. And the author would then have to prove if it's a local law that you don't need the permission, or if in doubt, you do ask for the whatever letter that they got from the ethics board to say whether it was a waiver or not. Is that correct?
Yes. If I can just say, there was a question in Q&A actually related to this case, asking why C according to the flowchart. So C, because the authors gave satisfactory information according to the editors, they said that they got permission to use of the anonymized data set, that this was not inclusion of participants in research. So they provided sufficient information to justify why they don't have a letter from the ethics committee, because this is according to the local regulations. So they did provide satisfactory answer to the editor, and that's why the editor continued with the processing of the manuscript.
And the editor can always double check the law.
Definitely, yeah.
Thank you, Anna.
Yeah,
and the second case now is about plagiarism, and I'll pass the screen to Simon.
Thank you, Trevor. Okay, so as Trevor said, the next case revolves around plagiarism. Here is the case study. So you as an editor have found that a review that your journal has published is firstly mainly a translated version of an article that's already been published by other authors in a different journal. The authors of the article in your journal did not declare that it was a translation of an already published article. To further complicate matters, the authors of the article in your journal include some of your editorial board. So the question is, if you are the editor of the journal, what are you going to do? Now, this is often, when I worked in publishing, this was often quite a common query. Typically, articles that appear in English language journals, the temptation for many authors is to translate from an article that has already been published in another journal in a different language. The authors understandably feel that their articles are good articles and deserve to have a wider audience. But obviously there are problems when it comes to the direct translation when an article has already been published elsewhere. This is quite a common occurrence for many editors, and particularly those of editors of journals in an English language. We're going to have our poll, and the poll, as with the other cases, are going to be 4 questions. So if you are the editor, do you A, retract the article? B, do you dismiss the editorial members? C, do you write to the authors and the institutions involved? Or D, is there another priority action that you would like to consider? So we've got nearly half the answers in already. We've got an early leader. Okay, we've got nearly 80% in. Does anybody else want to answer? Okay, I'll go end the poll. the most popular answer was C, that the editor should write to the authors and institutions involved. However, quite a number of people also, 43%, also chose A, which was to retract the article. And then just a few people thought that the editor should dismiss the editorial board members, and a few other people had different ideas. So I'm just going to look at the chat because there's a question there, or a comment, sorry.
Yes, 2 people in the chat have created a new D saying all of the above. Actually, I think the poll allows multiple answers. So you could press A, B, and C if you want, if you think
See, yeah.
all of them.
Okay.
But 2 of them said for the other that it was all of the above.
Okay, that's interesting. I do think there are other actions that you could take. However, all of the above is not correct, because in this instance, you would not straight away either retract the article, nor would you dismiss the editorial board members. And that's because at the moment, you as the editor, you simply don't have enough evidence to be able to make those decisions. There are possible explanations that would enable you to make that decision. So it may well be that once you had that further information, then you may decide to retract the article or dismiss the editorial board members. However, at this stage, all you know is that there is a similarity between the articles, and you've got an article that's been published elsewhere in a different language, but there are potentially explanations involved that would not necessitate retraction or dismissal. I'll stop. I'll come out of that. When unfortunately, I know from bitter experience that when you're faced with a plagiarism case, then the first action really is to find out as much information as possible. So this is one of our flowcharts that we use to go through plagiarism. And this is actually quite a straightforward one, but simply because in the first instance, you've been told that there's suspected plagiarism by somebody, and it doesn't really matter who that person is at this stage. The first priority is really to find out some more information. Now, many authors will have access to plagiarism software such as Authenticate, and they will be able to check the degree of copying. Now, this is really important because it may well be, for example, in a highly technical article, or an article that, for example, may include lots of English language terms, although it's in a not, the bulk of it is not written in a foreign language. There may well be a reasonable degree of similarity between the 2 papers that you're comparing, simply because there are no other ways to describe those terms. And there may also be, for example, lots of similarity in terms of the references that are used. So you have to understand the limitations of the plagiarism software when you're making the check. And that may show you that actually the copying is minor, and it's simply a case of, for example, the use of lots of different technical terms and the use of lots of the same metric references. That could be an explanation, but you need to find that out. And also you have to be clear about when you inquire about this, that we say that you contact the author in neutral terms. For example, in the UK, if you were to accuse an author of plagiarism straight out, and it actually was not the case, it was not in fact true that there was plagiarism, you could be that it could be a libelous comment. So you have to be very careful in using the word plagiarism. In English law, for example, then plagiarism is actually, in fact it has a legal definition, is actually 100% copied. So if an article is even 50% copied, for the purposes of this, then that's obviously too much. But if you started to accuse somebody of plagiarism straight off, then you could open yourself up to all sorts of counter accusations. So you have to be very, very clear. So in this case, if you check the degree of copying and you decide that it is minor and there's a good reason for it, then you can then inform the reader that you've looked at it. If, however, it's a clear case of plagiarism, I'll move on to the next slide, then you do have to contact the corresponding author in writing with some kind of cover letter and making sure that they've got an opportunity to give you any evidence that they have. Now, if the author then responds and gives you a satisfactory explanation, so in the middle channel there, then you can then go through and say, okay, well, we've now got this and it's been certified and validated. This is the reason, and you can inform whoever's told you about this in the first place that you followed everything through. However, if either there's no response or you have an unsatisfactory explanation, that's when it starts to get a little bit more tricky. Now, often I would suspect the most common response is actually no response when this kind of allegation comes up. And then you really don't have very much option other than to try and contact as many people as you, as well as the authors, contact the author's institutions as a way of getting to them. And if you still don't respond, then you just have to keep repeating this. However, if you're given an unsatisfactory explanation, and this could come in a variety of different forms, but essentially they're saying that, yes, the article has been copied, and kind of, so what, we thought this was okay. Then that's when you have to inform the editor of the other journal involved, because you're looking at things like redundant publication, etc. At that stage, you would then consider informing the author's superior, and you would also consider, if the authors are part of the editorial board, they've obviously at very best had a bad judgment in terms of getting involved in this article, and then you would then think about whether you should include them in terms of any action that you would take. That's why the answer is C, because there's lots of information that you would require before you actually make the ultimate decisions about, for example, dismissing the editorial board. Okay, so I'll hand now on back to Anna for interactive case 3.
So thank you, Simon. Just to add to that there is a possibility that authors are trying to do this relatively new type of plagiarism, translation plagiarism, because it can't be caught easily by Authenticate. And then, of course, in that case, if it's a clear case of translation plagiarism, probably, and then the editorial board members are involved, then probably all 3 ABC would probably be true in that case. But hopefully, it's a rare case. Okay, so now we go to case 3 with Anna.
Yeah. Thanks. If I can just comment, of course, there are also acceptable translations. So this is what is called a secondary publications, where an article is translated in full for different audiences in different languages, and that should be marked as such and should have been published with a notification of the source from which it has been translated, and would have to have permission from the original source for translation, unless it is a CC BY 4 license. It's kind of gets complicated, but definitely it should be transparent. So now we go to case 3, which is a bit longer case. Now we have done the presentation of these shorter cases, and these 2 next cases will be with the 2-step approach from us. So let's go to this case. So here you have to imagine yourself as to be editor-in-chief, and in a bigger journal, obviously, where there are several handling editors that deal with the manuscripts in addition to you as editor-in-chief, and they send out a submitted manuscript to 5 peer reviewers, okay, which is a good policy and practice, because very often we know that it's difficult to find reviewers. Very often they decline to review, so it is a good practice to send it to more than 3 of the planned. And very often some journals send it to more than 5 peer reviewers asking to accept the invitation. So what you learn is that 3 of the reviewers agreed to review, and all returned reviews that were very positive. They recommended the revision of the manuscript and suggested acceptance after these revisions. But when you look at it, and now you have to make a decision together, maybe with your colleagues, you as editor, you look at this and you see that these reviews are quite suspicious, and you investigate. And when you type in and look for publications for these 3 reviewers, you cannot find any past publications. Their email addresses are from web-based email providers, not from an institution, which doesn't have to be an indicator of misconduct, because as we know, in many developing countries, authors very often use their Gmails. And even I publish a journal in Global Health. Very often the authors use their Gmail addresses or some web-based email provider addresses because it's much easier to use them. And you finally discover this. All of these 3 reviewers actually do not exist. So the questions for you are what to do now. And let's start the poll to see what your next, what would you do? Now we have a little bit more than 50% of you that participated. Let's have some little bit more of the answers. Okay, any more that you want to comment? Okay, we have some comment in the chat, but I'll wait till we complete the poll. Okay, we have about 70% of you that have answered, so I'm going to share the results. And as you see, your favorite answer was B, ask the handling author to explain. And also a lot of you, like a little bit less than 30% and also a little bit more than 30% would reject the manuscript, and they would ask the author to explain. And there is other. Let's see if there is any comment in chat. I'm opening. One, Amado said that it would be good to send the manuscript to another set of reviewers. Okay, that's a good suggestion. And there is also a comment that if you're suspicious, there is always, from Itamar, there is always the possibility to send to other reviewers of your choice. However, some type of investigation is needed as to how non-existing reviewers managed to review. All of these answers are very relevant, but if we look at what to do, so the first step in this investigation is to see what to do. Now, what is the situation, whether you have any publication, which you already did, and you saw that you cannot find any publication from these reviewers, and then ask the handling or editor, and then ask authors and institutions. So I'm just going to stop sharing of the poll and see what would guidance from COPE say. So this is a flowchart for peer review manipulation. So when peer review manipulation is suspected during the peer review process, what do you do? What you do first is you suspend peer review process, okay, and then to investigate. And this is what you already did, is you have verified peer reviewer at organizations, but you couldn't find it because it wasn't sent from an institutional address. And if you cannot find the organization, then you follow the arm here, that you check the publication record, do online search, or review a database or find other means of independently locating email addresses. And you haven't been able to do so because you cannot find any publications about these authors. So you would look at the individual who suggested the name peer reviewers, a handling editor in this case, and ask for explanation. Okay, and what would be the next cases? Then we will have to see what happened and what to do. So now we're going to ask the handling author to explain. So this now we are going to part 2 of this case, where you have gone through the flowchart, and now you're asking the handling or editor to explain. So there were 5 reviewers that were nominated by the handling editor, but did not reply, 2 of them. And the 3 reviewers who reviewed the paper were actually suggested by the authors at the submission stage, and they were used for the peer review procedure, because the 2 reviewers that were nominated by the handling editors did not reply. So now we have learned what the handling editor did. Obviously, this journal had a policy to include both the reviewers suggested by the authors, and we can discuss that later, whether that practice is good, and also to use reviewers that are nominated by the handling editor. So you ask authors to explain, all authors, you send an email to all of them, and it's also a very good practice for the journals then to collect contact addresses for all authors, not just the corresponding author, but none of the authors reply. You also cannot find the Institutional Research Ethics Committee. You discover that the vice principal of that institution is the paper senior author, so you're in a bind because you have to send your query about ethics, possible ethics breach to someone who has conflict of interest because it's the senior author on the paper. So what you can do, you can see the poll now. What you're going to do: dismiss the handling editor, keep trying to contact the author institution, search for published papers with the same author's reviewers, or other. We have a lot of answers already. Okay, we have a chat, but I'm going to end poll now because we have 70% of you that have answered, and I'm going to share results as you see here. So as you see here, most of you said B or C, which I think is correct, because remember how we said that you have to, in the first case that we discussed, the case 1, that you have to keep on trying to contact the author institutions several times to see whether you will get any answer. And then you may extend your search for a published paper with the same authors or reviewers to see, maybe you have searched only one database, maybe you will find more information by searching some other databases, and these two would be the best approaches. Dismissing handling editor, I'm not quite sure, and if anyone has chosen that answer, and maybe they can write the reasons why they would dismiss the handling editor. Especially, we would have to take into account in the decision to dismiss the handling editor about the policy of journals about selection or using the peer reviewers for peer review, whether there is a policy to use any of the reviewers that were there, or you wait until you have one reviewer suggested by the author, but also one reviewer that was chosen by the editor to accept to peer review until you proceed with the peer review process. Sometimes it's very difficult nowadays. It's quite difficult to find reviewers, and I as an author have also experienced that, even having editors coming back to me and saying, oh, we have searched for the reviewers and we cannot find, can you suggest more, and so on. So it's not that clear cut. But let's see, there is one response in the chat that says reject. Okay, but I would say that rejection is maybe an option at the end, but one would like to see why reject. You have to provide the reasons and justification for rejection, and without a proper investigation into the process, it's quite difficult. So I have stopped sharing the results, and let me just go to another document from COPE that can help you, and that is how to recognize potential manipulation of the peer review process. So this is a general guidance for peer review. It's not a flowchart, but it is a kind of a summary of what you can look for at COPE, directing you to relevant COPE cases, and also to guidance on ethical guidelines to peer review, statement on appropriate manipulation of peer review process, about who reviews the reviewers. So there is a lot of information, and I can also say, as when I became the editor, I thought, okay, I'm a researcher. Usually most of us become journal editors because they are researchers. We think we know everything about the research and publication process, but then when you become an editor, you learn that there is so much that you have to learn, and we really have to get educated, and we have to come into a new profession of journal editing. So there is a lot of us that we can learn. So these are the features or patterns in review activities that we have to be able to recognize as an indication of that something may be wrong with the peer review process, like this non-institutional email addresses, suspicious email addresses, fictitious names that you cannot discover in the web or major databases, atypical features of the IP address. Also, one of the reasons why the first cases of this misuse of or these existent peer reviews were recognized because the author was reviewing its own paper, and the only reason why it was discovered because the agreement for peer review came quickly, and also the peer review was done in a day, and the editor was just surprised to see such an extremely quick response from reviewers, and that raised suspicions and the discovery that not only that one, but that many papers were actually reviewed by the authors themselves. Also, agreeing to review many manuscripts. But then there are conscientious reviewers who also like and see it as their duty to review, especially for journals that are close to their field of expertise. Authors that never, reviewers that never recommend rejections can also be a red flag. They are complimentary reviews, but which point out minor technical issues. Okay, maybe the paper is good. It shouldn't be the only criteria. Positive reviews in strong contrast to other reviewers is also a red flag. A review that is vague in style. So language is not typical of a parent's seniority or experience or educational background. Similarity to other peer review reports that come from different individuals, but they are very similar, like written by a single person or third party agency involvement. And this is something that we discussed earlier this week about paper mills, where one can buy papers, authorship on a paper, but you can also then perhaps buy a peer review too. So there are also best practices to minimize peer review manipulation, which is that you require that authors submit manuscripts to the journals by themselves. Nobody can do it in their name. At least one of the authors have to submit it. You encourage or require the use of international or institutional email, or the ORCIDs are a very good way of checking the institutional affiliation when inviting peer reviewers. Check that all the suggested peer reviewers by the authors, for example, qualified to review by checking their publications. It should be done not after the fact, but before the fact. And also look for these potential signs of peer review manipulation. So look for the behavior that may suggest that peer review manipulation is occurring. So that much from me. Thank you very much. And
Okay.
I look forward to the Q&A at the end.
Yes, thank you, Anna. And I wanted to add on that case, Anna, that if the journal's investigation finds out that it was a manipulated peer review, of course, they'd have to look at their own policies and, as you said, prevent only using the suggested peer reviewers. So it has to be a mixture, or some journals now have banned using suggested peer reviewers. And check your own papers, either submitted or already published, in case the same author group or the same reviewer group have been doing this for a long time. So you'd have to check the past papers as well.
Yeah, and if I can say, if this is discovered as a misconduct, then the whole other series is contacting the institution, looking for the resolution of the case, and finally retracting the paper if it was published. So that's something that would, have much more steps many more steps than we had so far. It's just opening new venues. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. And our last case is now going to come from Simon.
Okay, thank you, Trevor. So this last case is a little bit of a tricky one. So you do have to think about this somewhat. We're also a little bit behind schedule, so I'll just be as brief as I can. So in this case, you are again the editor, and you receive an email saying that an article that's been published in your journal has nearly the same title and content as an article previously published in an entirely different journal. Not only that, the author lists, so those people who are listed as the authors of these two articles, are both completely different. So we've got two articles in two different journals that have been alleged are nearly the same in title and content, but they also have different authors. So again, you as the editor, you have to decide what to do. So do you A, retract the article? B, do you inform the other journal about this duplicate publication? C, do you report the authors to their institution for plagiarism? Or D, do you take another course of action? So again, this can be quite a common occurrence for editors, particularly where you have this very, very similar articles, but different authors and perhaps other slightly different details in the articles, but the bulk of the articles do appear the same. And again, this also happens that your attention is often drawn to this by a third party, and then you have to decide what to do. So I'm going to launch the poll. Just over half the votes in, so please tell us what you think on this one. Last few ones, if people can vote, just a few more votes, and then I'll end the poll. So I'll end the poll and share the results. By far the most popular course of action was B, to inform the other journal about the duplicate publication. 13% said that the editor should report the authors to the institution, and just 9% said that the journal should retract the article. This is a slightly sneaky one.
And Simon, I'll read out some of the D ones.
Oh, thank you.
So some people have said talk to the other journal to establish the similarity and timelines, because the one who printed first doesn't mean that that was the original one. Someone voted B and D because you need to run an investigation, hopefully with the help of the other journal. And someone says, if there's a concerning level of similarity, then contact the authors for an explanation. So that's going to be an other, because we don't have an option saying contact the authors first. Someone else says maybe it should be clarified with the authors before taking action. So that's similar. Someone else said B and D, contact the authors first. And then D, other, you need to make sure it really is duplicate, because it might not be duplicate publication. And another one says report the authors to the institutions. I think that was C anyway. But so most people have who've put other have said talk to the authors and check what the actual issue is.
Yeah, and so that's a good percentage of people who kind of saw what we're trying to do here, because the answer really is D. Although B may be part of that, but again, we would recommend that you would have another course of action, because as those comments suggested, there's a lot more information that's required here before any action is taken. So particularly looking at, somebody mentioned about the timeline of publication, to check which journal did publish first and when the articles were submitted, etc. Also to contact the authors. So there's all sorts of potential reasons why the authorship may be different. Just to give you a very strange example I once encountered, we had exactly this instance, and the reason why there were two articles that were the same that were published with different authors was because a malicious PhD student submitted an article to a journal with their supervisor's name, because their supervisor had recently rejected their PhD. So the PhD student wanted to get their supervisor in trouble. So I'm not saying that's a common occurrence, thankfully, but there are lots of potential explanations as to why you may have two similar articles published in different journals with different authors. And so you really need to get to the bottom of that and try and find out what the explanations are first. So that's why we wouldn't recommend retracting the article at this stage, nor would we recommend reporting to the authors for about particularly talking to a third party about plagiarism, because as I mentioned before, you do have to be very careful about using that word. I would always recommend using the slight euphemism of similarity with regard to this and asking people to simply explain why there is similarity. So just looking at our resources. So one of the reasons why this case is a little tricky is because it actually is really two questions that need to be looked at. The first question is around responding to a whistleblower, and this is the COPE flowchart for doing that. Because when a third party raises a concern with you as an editor directly, then you, on the one hand, you do take it at face value in that you take it seriously, but you don't act on it at face value. You do have to look into the allegations that have been brought forward and gather as much evidence as possible. So what we recommend here on the flowchart is that you have to basically almost think about this as an investigator. Do the allegations contain specific and detailed evidence to support the claim? So you're trying to find independent evidence other than what the whistleblower said. So moving down the flowcharts, if there isn't any more evidence, then you will have to contact the authors and request more details about that, and then subsequently, if no more details are provided, then it's very difficult for you to respond because you don't have the required evidence to take the courses of actions that are potentially open to you. However, if you do get some kind of response and you are able to clarify and to validate these claims, then you can then respond to the person who's contacted you, and then you can go into the next formal investigation. So firstly, this is a whistleblower, so you need to check things out and get more independent validation of what's actually been raised. Then we go into the second case, which is, okay, so given that the whistleblower's claims do seem to be true, then we have redundant publication. And again, this is one of the more common flowcharts that are used from COPE. So the editors found out about a redundant publication. They've checked the extent and nature of the overlap redundancy. So they've done this kind of the evidence gathering part of this. So firstly, they're looking about the extent of the overlap. We didn't really get this in the actual case. And this is why we needed to get more evidence. Just how big is the overlap? Is it a major overlap? I mean, in some cases, it may actually be 100% if somebody's copied an entire article. Is it a minor overlap? What some people call salami slicing or salami publishing. In other words, for example, somebody's got a lot of data and they want to make the most of that data. So they publish 3, 4, 5 different articles that are essentially the same article, but just with slightly different data involved. And this is kind of because of the pressure to publish, etc. Authors may feel that they want to get the most out of their data and publish numerous articles that really only deserve one article with just the bigger data coverage. Or it may be that there's actually no significant overlap, and in that case, you can just go straight back to the reader, the whistleblower who's informed you in the first place. Now, I'm not going to go through this in too much detail because, as you can see, there is a lot of detail there to look through. But suffice it to say that what we try and do at COPE with these flowcharts is to try to broadly think about all the potential channels that such an investigation can have. And like I said, redundant publication is quite a common one. And what you'll find when you work through these channels, so I do recommend you go independently to look at this in a bit more detail, is that these channels reflect what is most often the case when these examples come to journals and they have to work through them. In terms of the kind of ultimate, what happens in the end, we kind of skip forward to the end, is that obviously we're thinking about who are the major stakeholders here. As a journal editor, ultimately you're thinking about the reader and the users of the journal community. and in particular, and that the whistleblower as well in this case, who's brought this action to you. But you're also thinking about the authors, and if there is a problem with the authors, that's when the institution starts to become involved. So it's only really when you start to find out, either when there's nothing at all, there's no information at all from the authors forthcoming, or when you start to find out something concrete where there's a legitimate publication ethics concern about the author's behaviour, then that's when the author's institution starts to become a stakeholder in this process, and then you contact them. Now, we'll move on to the next case because the case has moved on. As an editor, you then, having looked at all of this, you receive a request from the corresponding author to withdraw the article on the grounds that, quote, the same work has been published by my senior colleague in some other journal. So what seems to have happened here is that there may have been some kind of miscommunication where authors at the same institution have been working perhaps on the same project, but have then gone and started to publish things independently, which is plausible explanation. And this may have been flagged up to you before, because when you're finding out your information and looking at the different author lists, one of the things that you should really try and look for is there any correlation between the authors? They may be different people, but if, for example, the two sets of authors contain authors from the same institution, then obviously they're going to be working in the same subject area because they've worked on the same article. Therefore, that should give you a clue as to how this is going to pan out. So given that the editors received this email, we're going to have another quick poll here. What should you do? Now, do you decide to retract the article? A. B, do you decide to retract and remove the article? Now, in other words, not just retract it and put up a notice saying that the article has been retracted with full details of what the article's title was, etc., but actually just remove all evidence that the article ever existed. Or C, do you ask the other journal to publish a statement of redundant publication? And D, are there any other actions that you would prioritize at this stage? So I will launch the poll. There we go. Okay, so we've got 50% of answers in so far, and it's most people are for A, but there's quite a few other votes for B, C, and D. I can see now people are pressing multiple answers, if my maths is correct. If a few more, in the last 10 seconds or so, a few more people could choose what you would do. Okay, so I'll end the poll there and share the results. So we've got 44% of the choices made saying that the article should be retracted at this stage. And we've got 24% of the answers say that we should retract and completely remove it. And 28% think we should ask the other journal to publish a statement of redundant publication. And we've got some other options in the chat.
Yes, Simon, someone's put D, to inform the author that we'll do an investigation to see if the two articles have high similarity. And someone's written, I imagine the answer is to coordinate with the other journal to coordinate a retraction together, but not a removal at the same time.
Yeah, and that's really broadly the answer. I suppose the answer really is not B. There are certain very, very specific circumstances where an article should be removed entirely, but that doesn't apply in this case. So what COPE would recommend here, that there is a strong case here for the article to be retracted, because this is a case of redundant publication, and the article that's in your journal as the editor has already broadly been published in another journal beforehand. So that's a case to retract the article. And as such, the article retraction shouldn't really be done in isolation. So when you retract the article and put a notice up, then included in that notice is a full reference to the original article, the article that was first published. And if you're going to do that, you really should speak to the other journal and also ask them to publish a statement of redundant publication. In other words, what they'll say is that another article that was similar to this had been published elsewhere, subsequent to the publication here. However, that article is redundant. This is the original article. So that if you think about how authors find articles, then they may be going on keyword searches and simple Google searches, etc. So they may find either publisher site. And so if you have a notice at both ends, if you like, then the author is left in no doubt what the original article is, and also what happened with these two articles that have been published that were similar. There are other potential options open, which is why we'd also recommend to look at other. It could be that you could further investigate the authorship problem and refer the case to the institution. So particularly if there are two authors publishing independently from the same institution, then that is often could cause a cause for concern for that institution. If, for example, they may well be working in the same lab, they may well have signed the same contract as part of working in that lab or working in a certain research center, that actually means that they've broken that agreement, that internal agreement in the institution, by publishing independently. Often labs may have very kind of strict rules that you sign up to as an academic of that institution, and if you've broken that, then the institution would obviously want to know about it. So that's what we would suggest. So I'll stop sharing the poll, and before we go to the Q&A, just quickly go through the so what we have here is these are really good examples of because they are quite big, quite often quite complex. We've got 3 examples of discussion documents that COPE has. So firstly, we've got a discussion document on authorship. So this, for example, looks at specific things. So we've got a summary of what happens with the cooperation between research institutions and journals. So exactly what COPE would actually guide people with regard to how a journal and an institution should interact with each other. So for example, simple things like, if you are from the journal perspective, then you're trying to find out who the right person is at an institution. That may well be a chair, but it also probably should be, certainly most larger institutions, they'll have a research integrity officer who will be the person to contact about this. And there's whole sorts of kind of regulations and guidelines that these integrity officers work with, so they should be able to handle the case here quite well. We've also got guidelines. So for example, in terms of sharing information among editors-in-chief regarding possible misconduct. So if you do have a whistleblower that comes into that contacts you as a journal, then actually handling that information from a third party right from the word go, when you first get that email or the phone call about the potential misconduct in the journal, then there are guidelines in place that COPE's put together that you can follow. So as soon as that happens, then you can look at these guidelines, and those will hopefully help you follow the right course of action. And then we also have guidelines around retraction. Retraction is quite often misunderstood for understandable reasons. When you notice that we put retraction as an option in lots of the questions that we put in the polls, because that's always the temptation, is that as soon as there looks like there's something wrong with an article, well, you should retract it. But that isn't always the best course of action. But nor is it a last resort action either. There are quite delineated, specific approaches to retraction that you can follow, and that's something that COPE obviously takes very seriously, and it rewards people to look at these guidelines in depth to try and understand those pathways to retraction in full. Okay, I'll stop sharing. Trevor?
Thank you, Simon. And then I'd probably add that, of course, journals can try to avoid such problems by having a routine plagiarism or text matching test step as part of their procedure. So they should be routinely checking for text similarity anyway. Of course, it depends on timing for the first publication, but if it was already published, they would have found the text matching earlier on. So yes, now we come to questions and answers. And so thank you, Simon and Anna. And now it's time for the Q&A. So please do type any questions, general questions, to Michael, Simon, or Anna. Anything to do with COPE membership or any ethics problems or issues. And again, you can upvote questions already there. And if we don't get to them all, we'll answer them offline. So there was one question there before, but I think Anna answered it. It was to do with the first case on how to handle cases that don't have, papers that don't have ethical approval. So Anna, on that case, are there other situations which people might not be clear about and where especially new editors would also have to be careful about? Do you need ethics approval or not? Is there something to do with routine care doesn't count, if it's auditing, if it's anonymous polls, that type of thing?
Yeah, this is not a problem and a case for journal editors, but it is kind of a more general ethics question. And when you look at research, and you know that, for example, in Europe, within the European framework program, which was Horizon 2020 before, and now it's Horizon Europe, all grant proposals don't undergo only the scientific review, so evaluation and then being ranked for funding, but those grants that undergo scientific review and are ranked high, they also go through ethics review. And what has come out from these evaluation is that there is really great unclarity, so to say. There is not much clarity about ethics requirements, and especially there is a difference between scientific fields. So in medicine, you know, whenever we look at a person, we ask for ethics permission, although, for example, in case of aggregated anonymized data, especially if they are aggregated, and even if they are individual, and that care has been taken that individual persons based on a number of characteristics that are in the data set cannot be identified. These data are considered anonymous, and then they don't require ethics permission, and they are not under the personal data protection rule. So, but it's unclear, and the more you go into social science and humanities, I know some universities don't even have ethics committees, especially you have universities or schools that are completely social science universities and humanities. They don't even have ethics bodies because it wasn't a custom in the discipline. But nowadays, especially with the requirement from granting agencies, they do have ethics committees that have also some kind of self-assessment, and then they you have to submit a request to the ethics committee, but then the ethics committee waives some cases and say, okay, we identified that this is not an ethical requirement or for approval for this type of data set or this type of research. It's low risk. We just waive, or we say, you know, we don't even have to waive, but it doesn't raise ethical questions. So it is a kind of a developing area. So I would advise journal editors to keep abreast of the developments in this field, and also to require from their authors the explanations if the ethical approval has not been provided, why and what is the justification for it. So I would say transparency from from authors would be a first step for a journal editor to ask for clarification. And of course, if the ethics approval is needed, then to ask for documentation, and not just saying we received ethics approval from our local committee, but I would ask also for the document number. So you usually receive an official document as a researcher. So as a journal editor, I would ask for a document number for the ethics approval, so that if there is any later allegation of any misconduct, that you can go to that document, and at least, you know, you can ask the institution about the document, and so on and so on. So there is a lot to think about. It is quite a challenging topic and issue.
Yes, thank you, Anna. So I think the lesson is, if in doubt, to be safe, get a letter, even if it's a waiver.
Yes.
I have a question for Simon, because you had two cases to do with possible redundancy or plagiarism. What cases, when is secondary publication allowed then?
So, like we tried to, I think, you know, underline in cases that we have, then the first port of call really is to find out more information about the second publication. So you may well have explanation. You may well think, for example, that there's no possible explanation to justify a secondary publication. But then when you actually do find out the circumstances, then you may actually conclude that it is justified, or rather not justified, but it's, I suppose, really what's really important is in terms of the not entering into the blame game too quickly, and to try and find out as much information as possible. Off the top of my head, if I'm trying to think about secondary publication, then I mentioned before about there may well be explanations with regard to similarity, and you do have to be very careful about the level of similarity. So if, for example, you may well have an article that is a part 1 and part 2 article, and it's not quite salami slicing because the author has said that there's part 1 and part 2, but what the author hasn't done has used, shall we say, independent language between both articles. So it's not justifiable to simply copy the methodology for the first and the second article and say that's correct. But understandably, an author will find it difficult to phrase, particularly if it's quite a technical article, to phrase things entirely differently in both instances. So I think there are occasions where there is a justification for a secondary publication, but that doesn't absolve the author from making the required changes to it. All it does is that it requires the editor to be a little bit more understanding and open-minded in terms of the potential explanations that the author may have for secondary publication.
And I think ICMJE have some guidelines too about if you're upfront and transparent, you want to reach a different audience, you can say actually in the title of the work it's an abridgment or a translation. So there is a procedure to do it. Also, there's some consensus guidelines sometimes that get published in many venues at the same time. Michael, I have a final question. What if someone wants to submit a case to forum, to the quarterly COPE forum? It's got to be an anonymized case, and it's usually a complex case that doesn't quite fit with any of the flowcharts.
Okay, so it doesn't have to be anonymized, because what actually the first thing we do, in fact, it's probably easier if it's not anonymized, because we can then, but the COPE team behind the scenes will then anonymize it. So what you're seeing now is what we would typically see in a forum. So what we see is anonymized, but what would come to COPE is not, because we then can then refer things back and make appropriate recommendations based on your on the facts as they actually are, as opposed to the anonymized facts. So just write to the COPE administration, and they'll forward it on. And please do, because this is a wonderful resource for us. It's one of these wonderful win-win situations.
Yeah, and usually because the cases are tricky or complex and maybe combine a few of the flowcharts, it's not a simple case. Usually it leads to either our updating of our own flowcharts and guidelines, or it can lead to a new discussion document of a new area. So we are coming to the end of this workshop now. So I'd like to thank our speakers, Simon, Michael, and Anna. And just to let you know, for more information, our website does have lots of useful resources for new editors. There's a short guide to ethical editing for new editors. You can join the COPE forum. There's an e-learning course with 10 modules in the members only site. And there's also a useful COPE audit that you can do for your journal. So please email me if you have any comments on our available resources, or if you have suggestions for further educational COPE resources. And again, I'd like to thank Michael, Anna, and Simon, as well as our COPE staff, including Natalie, Linda, Sarah, Saba, David, and Bonnie. So finally, on behalf of COPE, I'd like to thank everyone also for attending this webinar. I hope you found it useful. Thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye.